This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the best way to turn your passion into a website. I know that I know nothing. This is the Socratic paradox, one of the most famous ideas in 2 millennia of philosophy. It's what separates the arrogant know-it-all from the true scholar, who is, yes, curious, but also humble in their path. Nobody wants to be the prideful one, of course, but sometimes we are. And it's easy to point out the mistakes of other people, and hard to spot our own shortcomings. Of course, it's easy for me to sit here and talk about intellectual humility, but on its own, that's kind of useless. Because even if you do accept that as a good value, one that should be pursued, you still need a mechanism to get there. You need a way to test yourself and a way to get feedback, because there won't always be a teacher in your career of self-learning. To do that, you have to know what knowledge you're missing in the first place, because you can't solve a problem that you're not aware of. Trying to learn without any feedback is risky business, because you could sink hours and hours studying a topic only to then realize you don't really understand it later on. And all of that effort was misguided and directionless. That's where the Feynman Technique comes in. It's a 4-step system that can quite literally make you an expert on any topic. And I know that sounds too good to be true, but it does do that. And of course, there is effort on your behalf, but with some practice and patience, it does happen. And it's time flexible as well. You could finish the whole process in 10 minutes if you're in a rush. Or if you want a deeper look, you can stretch it out to an hour. It's completely up to you. Above all, it offers honest, real-time feedback. And that is so damn important in learning because we tend to overestimate how much we truly know. And it's hard to gauge. It's like when you think you're ready for an exam in school, but you go into the exam hall, you have the paper in front of you, and you realize that was a lie, and I'm screwed. But hold on, there's a problem, because who am I to pitch you this? I'm not a scholar, I'm not a professor, I'm not even an author yet. And I'm just someone like you who likes to learn in their spare time. But luckily, the name on the tin does not belong to me, and that credit is to someone much greater. Of course, Richard Feynman is the name behind this technique, and that's why I trust it and I'm confident in sharing it with you. He was a famed physicist and actually won a Nobel Prize in physics. But perhaps above all, he had an amazing reputation as a teacher. Not only was he charismatic, which you can actually see in some of his lecture recordings here on YouTube, but he was relatable. He wasn't like those stuck-up professors you sometimes had in college, or they'd come in huffing and puffing, they'd read off the whiteboard, and it was clear they didn't give two shits about teaching you. Feynman was different because he connected. He dropped all of the pomp of the academic world, the fancy words, the twatty attitude, and he just shared his knowledge in a humble, down-to-earth way. One of the things he was most famous for, which you'll see in his technique later, is that he got these really complicated and technical ideas from, quantum physics and stuff, and then condensed them into simple terms that you or I can understand. Despite his status, people would remark how he felt like a normal human, walking with them in the same pursuit of truth. But look, despite all of these learning techniques, sometimes you just don't have the time or the will to learn something from scratch. For example, I know nothing about web development, but that's perfectly fine because Squarespace gives me all of the resources I need to make it a reality. With the Fluid engine, you can customize every little detail of the website in a drag and drop style, so it can perfectly match the vision you have inside your head, which is what I've done with my homepage here. I also really enjoy the analytics page because it's so interesting to see where the interaction is coming from. And whenever you're growing anything online, data like that is damn important. So this just makes it that one bit easier for you. There's also the option to add custom CSS. So with like 5 minutes of research, I managed to embed my newsletter sign-up form directly into the website, which is so convenient for me. If you head to squarespace.com, you can use their free trial to design a website. And once you feel ready to launch it, you can then go to squarespace.com/Odysseus and use code Odysseus to get 10% off of that first website. So do check that out. So what is this technique and how can you put it into motion? I don't want to bore you with a long explanation, so I'm going to show you how you can put it into practice with a real example. And because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, how you could maybe put a spin on it to better serve you. The first step is straightforward enough. You study the topic. Of course, it depends on who you are and what you choose to study, but I like to use different resources to mix it up, different types of media. For each of these sources, I'll write notes, and these will ultimately all end up in the same place, which is my Obsidian vault. And after about 10 or 20 sources on a topic, you should have a pretty solid understanding, or at least something to work with and something to talk about. Now, how you write notes and how you can build your own network of notes like you see here is a whole rabbit hole. So I'm going to link some videos down below on how you can set that up, how you can approach books and how to take notes effectively. Of course, you can consume just one thing, but I do recommend branching out a bit and picking at least a few, because that way you can get a wider perspective. One source might raise a counter argument that you didn't see elsewhere, or an interesting idea, or an analogy that helps you understand it better. And all of that is only exposed to you if you do spread out. The more you read, the more new ideas come, and they just build on top of each other into this mountain of knowledge. Now, with the knowledge that you've earned, it's time to take advantage of this technique's workhorse. Step 2 is where you teach what you learn. And if that sounds confusing or too much effort, don't worry, because there's no classrooms here, there's no students, there's no teachers. When I say teach what you learn, I mean share what you know to an imaginary audience or a reader. In most cases, it's going to be yourself. First, you pick an idea or a subtopic relating to what you learned. Now, try not to make it too broad because, it's not easy to summarize the entire history of Rome, for example. You want to keep it narrow enough to be manageable. For example, I might be reading about ecology as a whole, but for this example, I'm just going to narrow it down to natural selection. You then elaborate and explain the idea as if you're helping someone else understand it. And don't stress yourself with fancy words or essay-style writing, because no teacher is grading these. And it's purely a tool for your own learning rather than a final write-up. Plus, trying to sound intellectual here might actually be sabotaging all of your efforts, because we often use big words as a mask to disguise our ignorance. When you work using simple words, you are forced to boil the idea down to its bare bones. And you can only do that if you understand it intimately. And you'll see how we can do that in the next few steps. The simplest medium to do this on is a pen and paper. You put the title of the topic at the top, and then you follow with maybe a description or an explanation. A good pointer for this is to write as if you're explaining it to a 7-year-old who's completely oblivious to the idea. It may sound like overkill, but as Albert Einstein probably said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't know it well enough. And that is exactly what this technique lives by. It's also super helpful to use diagrams, examples, and analogies to get your point across, because that proves to you that you understand it and can apply it to many different situations. And most importantly, it's fun. I'm not going to bullshit you and say that I use this technique for every single thing I learn, because I don't. And if you did, that would take way too long in your already busy day. I would probably save it for the most important or the most challenging ideas that I feel deserve that little bit of extra time and attention. 90% of the time, I use a quickfire version of this technique, which takes literal minutes, and I'll show you that a bit later. We all accept in society that people learn differently, so why not apply the same idea to teaching? I like to make these nice mind maps of the topic on my whiteboard, but you could also do something like a mock speech, which is a fancy way to say talking to yourself. So the format is completely up to you, and you should do whatever feels right. Steps 3 and 4 are the hardest parts, where most of the work is going to be. And I wouldn't be dishonest with you and say that this is some hack or trick for effortless learning, because it's not. It's a tool for meaningful learning, and anything meaningful has to have some effort behind it. In step 3, you spot any gaps in your understanding. During the teaching, you might be confident for most of it, but even then, there will be parts that you don't know how to explain, or details that you stumble over, and these are the precious things we're looking out for. You might see that as a failure at first, but why? That's exactly what we were looking for. That's the precious feedback which we need to grow and to learn, and to move past our initial understanding. It's the whole point of the Feynman Technique, and without that failure, nothing happens. This leads naturally to step 4, which is where you return to the source materials and try to grasp what you were missing. During the teaching process, I might jot down a few questions that I want to double check afterwards, or things that I'm unsure about. I then follow up on those questions. I try and answer them and leave feeling more confident than I was beforehand. And even if you can explain everything perfectly, your time isn't wasted, because of course you retain the information better, but now you have a natural next step to follow up on. If I were in that position, I would take inspiration from toddlers. I would ask why, and that would lead me down this new train of thought that I would have never seen otherwise. There will always be new and exciting things to learn about, but they only reveal themselves to you if you look for them through something like this technique. Normally in step 4, when you revisit the source material, the idea is to have another go at explaining it so you can do better than last time. Every new round of teaching gives you a clearer picture, but what if you feel like you've already understood it pretty well? Well, you can actually apply a 5th step to make your knowledge bulletproof. In this 5th step, you take everything you've learned and do your best to simplify it as much as possible. I know it doesn't sound like much at first, but trust me, once you start, it really tests you. Explaining how batteries work or how Plato viewed the soul is doable when it's someone else who's on your level, but explaining that to an imaginary 5-year-old, suddenly it's much harder. If you take this idea and you struggle to package it in any way you wish, then that's a good sign you're not as confident as you think you are, and maybe there's more work to do. And if you don't get what I mean here, then I want you to pick an idea that you know inside out, something that you're super confident in. How would you explain that to a criminal in a street gang? How would you then explain it to some rich teenager who's out of touch with society, or a middle-aged woman? Of course, you would change your language. You would change the examples you use. You would change how you illustrate it and how you deliver it to them. A good teacher who truly understands the topic can take the same idea and repackage it 20 times, depending on who they're talking to. And they're going to change it for them to understand it best. And that's the same thing we're trying to do when we simplify the idea. So that's the Feynman technique, something that great philosophers and thinkers have been using for thousands of years, even before Feynman put his name on it. But it can take a while. And you're a busy person, so you don't always have that time. Now, I said earlier that I save this only for the most important ideas, and I only do it every now and then. And I also said that there was a quick fire version. It's maybe fast, but it uses the same principles as earlier to help you understand what you read. It's as simple as rephrasing the main points you encounter. I will take the author's message, and in the margins, I'll write just a sentence or a phrase summing up that whole idea in my own words. If I can do that successfully, then it's proof to myself that I have understood the idea. It's that simple. And if I notice that I'm struggling to do that, I will, of course, reread the passage and have a think about it. You can repeat this throughout the whole book or video or article, and it will only add on a few extra minutes onto your time, which makes it a really good option. So that's the Feynman technique. And whether you use the short version, the long version, or a bit of both, you should ultimately do what serves you the best and what makes the most sense in your head for learning. Also, I feel like I'm overlooking something here. I feel like there's a more innovative way to apply this that makes more sense. So if you have any ideas on that, do let me know. My emails are open, the comments are open, feel free. And of course, thank you for watching.